All right, I will get started. Welcome to the Coastal Conservancy's Grantee Onboarding meeting. Congratulations to you all on getting funding approval for your project at our April 23rd, 2026 board meeting. I am Linda Tong, Deputy Program Manager of the Bay Program at the Conservancy, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Sarah Haugen and Cherie Erickson. We will be the project managers, folks, sharing some introductory information with you all on how to start your Conservancy grant, how to manage it throughout the term of the grant, and how to close the grant once your project is complete. Many of you may be new grantees, so this should hopefully be helpful for you all. But if you are a returning grantee, welcome as well. We're hoping that this will be a helpful refresher. Again, this meeting is being recorded and we can share the slides as well as the link to the recording likely later this week or early next week. Please feel free to leave your video on or off during this meeting, but we will have some scheduled question breaks after each section in this presentation. And to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself during our breaks. We'll also have plenty of time at the end for folks to ask questions. And if you have a quick question that you want to enter into the chat, we'll be monitoring that as well. If you have any technical assistance needs, also let us know in the chat, or you may be able to directly message Sarah Haugen and we will do our best to help you. Congratulations on receiving your grant from the Conservancy. Thanks for your work that you all do, and we're very excited to help fund your project. Everything that we're covering today is also outlined in the Grantee manual that's found on our website, and that is under our Grants tab at the top of the page. And there is a drop-down menu where you can click on resources for grantees. Here it's shown by the yellow circle on this page. And this is just an introductory presentation today. If you have any questions throughout the term of your grant, please reach out to your assigned project manager and let them know if you need any assistance. Before we go into the process of our regular grants, I'm going to touch briefly on our acquisition projects. They do follow a different process from the rest of our grants. And if you are a grantee with an acquisition project, please set up a time with your project manager to discuss the process, since it is different and expedited. So for acquisition process, generally, you will still need to execute the grant agreement first. And there are a bunch of different documents that you'll need to provide to the Conservancy for review, listed here. They include an appraisal, a preliminary title report, purchase and sale agreement, draft escrow instructions, preliminary closing statements, and among other documents. The Conservancy will prepare a draft offer to dedicate document and send that to you for review. This offer to dedicate document would be recorded during closing to ensure that the property is used for the purposes, acquisition purposes that are outlined in the Conservancy's grant. And then once all these items are finalized, the grantees submit an invoice request letter to the Conservancy, and the Conservancy would send a check directly to, that can be directly put into escrow. We do have a template for all of this, and that invoice request letter should be sent at least 20 business days before close of escrow to make sure there's enough time for processing. And again, if you have an acquisition project, please work closely with your conservancy project manager. We have checklists, detailed checklists for what we need from a grantee. I will move on to the process for our regular grants now. And these include planning, implementation projects, Explore the Coast projects, wildfire program projects, and more. This graphic provides a high-level view of our granting process that you would go through from start to finish. And we'll go into a little bit of detail about each of these topics and can pause for questions throughout. First step, executing a grant agreement with the Conservancy. This grant agreement outlines the terms and conditions of the grant between your organization and the Coastal Conservancy. We have our typical grant conditions listed in our grantee manual, and you can review that while your Conservancy project manager is drafting the grant agreement. And as you're reviewing the typical grant conditions, please let them know if you have any questions. Your Conservancy project manager will then send the drafted grant agreement to you through DocuSign for signature, but please make sure you read through the agreement before you sign that. As part of that process, you will need to submit a Form 204, and this form is a standard way for grantees to provide the Conservancy with an address where reimbursement checks will be sent. And even if you've had a Conservancy grant in the past, we'll ask for a new Form 204. As your Conservancy project manager is drafting your grant agreement, it's important to discuss your project schedule with them, since there will be 3 important dates that are specified within the grant agreement relating to the completion of the project and closeout of the grant. The first important date would be the work completion date. That is the date that you plan for all work under this grant agreement to be done. And this date is especially important because you will not be able to bill the Conservancy for work that is completed after this date. The second date to keep in mind is the final request for disbursement date. That's the date that you submit your final report and final invoice to the Conservancy on. Just so you know, the invoice we typically also call the request for disbursement. Generally, this date is set 1 month after the completion date. And the third date to keep in mind is the termination date. This is the termination of your contract with the Conservancy, and typically is set 3 months after the work completion date. For a planning grant. For construction projects, this date will be 20 years after the completion date, since our grant agreements require that all capital improvements are in place and maintained for at least 20 years. Acquisition grants also extend out 20 years. Your grant agreement will have a specific number assigned to it that you would be using for future documentation and your invoices. Next, we have the work program and other conditions precedent to disbursement of funds. Your grant agreement will have a section that lists out some conditions precedent to disbursement of funds. Please note that you cannot start work under this grant agreement until you've satisfied all of these conditions precedent and you've received a notice to proceed letter from your conservancy project manager. The typical conditions are listed here on this slide. And the first one is the grantee board resolution. The resolution tells the conservancy that your governing body has agreed to enter into this agreement with us and identifies who's authorized to sign the grant agreement. We have a template online, but if you do have your own version of this that you would like to use instead, please let your project manager know. Second is insurance. We currently require $2 million in liability for construction projects and $1 million in liability for planning projects. If you are a returning grantee, you might remember that we used to require that the conservancy was listed as an additional insured. We don't require that anymore. We just need to see proof of your organization having insurance. And these insurance requirements might differ according to your grant. Please refer to your grant agreement for those specific requirements. And if it's a construction project, you may need there may be an additional insurance requirement if you are contracting with a firm for more than $250,000. One note is that if your grant requires specific insurance and it increases your premium, you may be able to charge the conservancy grant for that extra charge. Again, please talk to your project manager about this and save documentation of this price increase if this applies to you. Here's a list of common insurance minimums. We talked about general liability, but here are the minimums for automobile liability, workers' comp, watercraft liability, if that applies, course of construction or property insurance. And these won't, apply for every single grant, but if it does apply to you, please talk through that with your project manager. And we can pause now for some questions, if there are any.
I have a question from Santa Cruz County.
Yes.
Not sure if we have insurance. The county has insurance. Is that something typical from cities and counties?
Yes, and sometimes cities and counties may be self-insured, and so please also talk with your project manager if that is the case, and we can get documentation of that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. Is there anything in the chat we should address now, Sarah?
Nothing in the chat.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to our next section.
Okay. Hi, I'm Sarah Haugen, project manager in the Bay team. I'll be going over the work program. So this is another piece of the conditions precedent. It's your roadmap for doing the project, includes tasks, deliverables, your schedule, a task level budget for the project. It'll tell us how you'll complete the project, and it's a document that guides your invoicing as well. We have a template available on our website, and when you open it, you'll see there's a lot of orange instructions of how to fill it out. It may take a few revisions to get it right with you and your project manager, and is considered a living document that can be modified with your project manager throughout the course of the grant. And you can request this, with your project manager. It's more detailed than the grant agreement, but not so detailed that you are holding yourself up to very specific requirements. Next slide. The first part is the project description. There it is. It's top of the work program. You'll fill in this, which just has a concise, high-level summary of your project, similar to what you might find in the staff recommendation, stating the goals of your project and how you will achieve them. It's usually just a short paragraph. It might be longer if you have a really complicated project. Like I said, just think about what's in your grant agreement or staff recommendation as a starting point. Your goal and the steps toward the goal. Next, you'll have a scope of work. So these are the different tasks within your grant program. The common categories we have are project management, which for us means grant management. So the time spent managing the grant. Could be things like design, community engagement, tribal engagement, environmental review, permitting, implementation, monitoring, anything that's relevant for your project. And you might have done this in your grant application, so you could start there. You can also use subtasks to organize these activities if that helps you conceptualize the different phases of your project. And when you submit your invoices, you'll just use those big level tasks. So let's say project management, planning, monitoring, whatever. It's just easier for everyone to track. And so you'll work with your project manager to figure out what level of detail makes sense for your project. And within each task, you'll define deliverables, which are documents that you'll submit as part of your project. So it's not like, a milestone. It's like a physical, not really physical, but a document that you will turn in that shows you did a thing. So that's what a deliverable is for us. Then there's the schedule, which is an overall schedule of your project by those same overall bucket tasks you drafted. You'll copy over the deliverables from above, and you'll have your estimated start date and completion date. This just helps us, understand how far along you are. If things are falling behind, you can work with your project manager to adjust the dates. This just gives a good overview of how things will go with your project. Next slide. Next is the budget. And again, this is in those same tasks from earlier, and it's very important for invoicing. You'll copy these amounts into your request for disbursement, which Sheree will talk about. But these are the kind of the numbers you're working with within each task and adding up to your total grant amount. The simpler it is, the easier it is to have flexibility. So that's why we don't break it down into subtasks in this level. You don't need to list the costs from other funding sources in your work program unless there's matching funds required by your grant. And you and your PM can, communicate about what your other costs or grant amounts are just for context. But for the work program, keep it simple, just your grant tasks. Next is the budget details, where you'll describe what the budget will be used for. Your project manager will use this to make sure the costs that you're billing for are all aligned with your approved tasks. Under direct expenditures, you'll put things like materials, equipment, travel, and food costs. Then you can use staff time. In the work program, you can just put the job titles of staff and what they'll be doing. You don't need to put information about their hourly rates or number of hours they might work on that for the grant, because it's just too detailed. But when you submit your invoices, your request for disbursements, you'll put staff position, number of hours, rate, and that's how you'll calculate how much you're billing for a specific task. You can bill for stipends, for example, for community engagement. You're allowed to do cash payment, but things like gift cards and transit passes are not allowed. So just check with your project manager early on if you intend to use stipends. For subcontractors, you'll need to provide the name of each subcontractor, their qualifications, usually like a website link to their company and what they'll be doing in your project. So a subcontractor is an entity that will be carrying out scope for you. So if let's say you're designing something and you hire someone to help you with designs, that's a subcontractor. But like paying for something like an installation of a fence or something, generally not. So just talk to your project manager if you're not sure if a vendor you're using is a subcontractor or just a one-time receipt for purchase. Indirect costs, we allow for indirect costs to be billed to the grant up to 20% overall. Please work with your accountant to calculate an indirect rate that can be supported in case of an audit. And if you're using climate bond funds, there's some additional restrictions, which are available in our budget guidelines, but I'll just overview them briefly. That Any calculated indirect cost is allowed. So however you and your accountant calculate it is fine. Just you need to be able to show your work if you get audited. They cannot exceed 20% of the grant. They also can't exceed $1 million. They cannot be applied for acquisition costs, and they can only be applied to the first $100,000 of each subcontract. So if you have a lot of subcontractors in your grant, just keep an eye on that. And also, we'll note that all of our grantees that receive our funding are required to meet strict accounting standards. It's rare, but it's possible you can be audited because it's a state grant. So make sure you're following all the generally accepted accounting principles published by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. We're not accountants, but you need to make sure you have that all in line. Next is the plan for acknowledgement. The Conservancy requires physical acknowledgements such as signage for restoration and acquisition projects, and software acknowledgements for projects, including communications materials that mention the project. Having this recognition out in the world for the public to see helps ensure that future funding is available if people know what the Conservancy is and the kinds of things we fund. So that's why we require it. So yeah, there's some examples here on the slide, and there's plenty of guidance in our grantee manual and on our website. This wraps up the conditions precedent section. It can take a lot of staff time, so if you're having trouble with this, talk to your project manager. If you need to charge staff time to this part of the grant, it's a kind of case by case. But otherwise, you shouldn't be billing until after your notice to proceed, which is the next slide. So this is once you've completed all those items we just discussed, which we can take questions in a second, your project manager will send you a notice to proceed letter, or otherwise known as a start work letter. And you can't start billing for work until after the date that's on this letter. So if it's today, you can't start billing until May 7th and onward. Next slide. I just said this, but there's where the date would be for your notice to proceed. So anything prior to that date cannot be billed to the grant unless you've already talked to your project manager about billing some staff time for preparing your conditions precedent. Next slide. Then you can start work on your grant. And here's where we can take any questions that have come up. I'm seeing maybe something in the chat that Linda answered.
It's me again, Greg from Santa Cruz County. So
Sure.
we have a grant to help with the hiring and of a engineering consultant for a parking lot. And I was told that the Coastal Conservancy is going to fund up to 65% design. So we are putting out an RFP for a total design. So in the work agreement here, a work program, should I just list up to 65% as far as the tasks? And then we're going to try to go for another grant for the finishing. Does that make sense?
Generally the work program should just cover what the grant is paying for. So if it's up to 65%, that would be, your design deliverable could be 65% plans, and then you'll just bill up to that point.
Okay, and then after we hit that 65%, we'll send you some of the deliverables and then apply for the next phase for another grant.
Yes, if you were approved up to a certain percentage, you can try applying. Again, I'm not sure how that is going for which team you are working with, but generally we phase things out like that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions about the work program?
Yeah, just to share the question that was in the chat. The question was if tasks within the work program have to match what was in the grant application. And to answer that, like the total grant award that the board authorized should remain consistent, but as you work with your project manager on like the task breakdown, like we understand the grant application was just an estimate and there may be some shifting up between tasks as you work out the work program. And then our indirect costs, I think the question is, are indirect costs calculated based on like your organization's internal overhead costs? And Sarah, you mentioned like, yes, you can use your organization's calculated indirect cost, but we still have those limits of the indirect cost not being 20%, but not being over 20% of the total grant award. And we also have like a total limit on what that indirect cost can be.
Yeah, and for those who might use other terms, indirect is pretty much the same as overhead. It's whatever the cost of doing business is for you to keep the lights on, buy staplers. That's how those are the kind of things you can put into your indirect cost calculation. Okay, if not anything else, we can go to progress reports and invoicing.
Great. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Cherie. We're going to be going over progress reports and invoicing. So I'll just preface this all by saying that you're about to get a lot of information about invoicing and how to submit your request for disbursement. And a lot of you are maybe a little bit far away from that stage. So this is all just like an initial introduction to the information. All of this information is on our website, and you can always come back to this video because it is about to be a lot of information that maybe isn't super applicable at the moment to you. So, this is super important because it's how we track your project and also how you get paid for your project. So, how do you get paid? To get reimbursed for project expenses, you should invoice no more frequently than monthly and no less frequently than quarterly, so every 3 months. And quarters are typically January to March, April to June, and etc. But there's no set calendar, so as long as you're billing every 3 months, then that is great. And the Conservancy enforces invoicing deadlines. And if you fall severely behind, there's risk that will ask you to stop work on your project until you get caught up on all of your invoicing. And also, just a reminder, Sarah already mentioned this, but you can't invoice for any work prior to the start date of your project, which is that date on the notice to proceed. And invoices can't cross into a new fiscal year. So our fiscal calendar runs from July to June, so you can bill all the way up to June 30th, and then for any work after that, you'll include it on your next invoice starting July 1st. So basically, you just can't have one invoice that covers both June and July. And what is invoicing? So these consist of the progress report, the request for disbursement, the RFD, and also backup documentation. So you're going to combine all of these docs into one single PDF and then email it to the email here, invoices@scc.ca.gov, and CC your project manager. And then all of those deliverables are going to be sent directly to your project manager. So you don't have to include those in that invoice packet. So here we have a view of the request for disbursement form. This is an example form. There are 2 pages to fill out. The cover page summarizes expenses from the billing period and the overall funds spent. And then the second page breaks down each of those expenses by type and task. So we have this form in both PDF format and Excel format, and both of those can be found on our website. So we'll look at each of those pages in a bit more detail. So here is RFD page 1. And this page summarizes all the expenses from the billing period and the funds spent to date. The address, which is in blue in the upper left corner, must match the address listed on that STD 204 form, or the payee data record form, which is what it's called. This is the address where checks will be sent to, and if you want your checks sent to a different mailing address, like a PO box, ask your project manager about filling out, you guessed it, an additional form, and we can get that check sent to a separate address. The task budget section highlighted in yellow can be copied directly from your work program. And if task 1 is project management, the left column should say task 1, project management, followed by the task budget in the next column. Okay, cost incurred this period is the amount of costs you are billing to each task in that period. And then the total cost to date are how much has been billed to each task to date. And then finally, the remaining is the remaining balance for each task. The form will auto-calculate it for you. And just as a tip, everything in yellow on this, or yellow or green, whatever color you see, will be auto-calculated for you, and then everything in blue is what you have to fill in. And there's a little key on the bottom of the first page, too, in case you forget. So our withholding policy has recently changed. Previously, we withheld 5% from each invoice, but under our current policy, we're only withholding the final 5% of grant funds, or $100,000, whichever is less. And then you can request the release of this withholding on your final invoice at the end of your grant, once the project is complete and you've submitted all of the deliverables. Okay, and then we move on to page 2, which further breaks down the expenses that were already listed on page 1. The first section, section A, lists all grantee expenditures, and this includes labor and subcontractors and direct costs. So under labor, this is where you would list the title, hourly rate, and number of hours worked, as well as the tasks that that person worked on. And you do not need to submit timesheets to us. You should keep them in case there's an audit, but we don't need to see timesheets as backup documentation for labor. For subcontractor charges, you'll list the company name, the invoice number, the amount, and attach their invoices backup. And then finally, for indirect costs, that includes things like materials, equipment, travel, direct costs. Materials, equipment, travel, you must attach a receipt for each of those costs. And then section B is the indirect cost, and that rate must match the indirect cost rate listed in your work program. And then that grand total circled at the bottom of the page should match the grand total on the first page. So let's look at backup documentation. So first we'll talk about subcontractors. You should provide subcontractor invoices as backup, and that must include a description of the work completed as well as how much it costs. And a subcontractor provides a service through a contract with the grantee. And here are some examples that we have: cultural resource specialist, community engagement facilitator, and more. So yeah, if you're confused on whether something is a subcontractor or a direct cost, just ask your project manager. Here are some backup documentation examples for materials. Some important things to note: you must include paid receipts for materials and supplies, so it should say paid on there somewhere. It shouldn't be an estimate. Online purchases, like the Amazon purchase here, must show that the materials have been shipped. Bank statements are not considered sufficient backup documentation, and just remember to save all of your receipts. Next, we'll move on to backup documentation for travel expenses. Travel reimbursement rates can be found on our website. To better support our grantees, we've updated our travel rates. If you've been awarded a grant with us before, be sure to check out those new rates. We reimburse personal vehicle mileage costs at state rate. And currently, actually, this is as of January of 2025, but I think it's still accurate, or it might be a little bit more. It's 70 cents per mile. Sarah or Linda, if you know the updated rate, can you put that in the chat? It might be like slightly higher, but around 70 cents per mile. And then this table shows an example of how to document mileage reimbursement, and please include the date, locations, mileage, and then the total amount. And if you don't want to provide that table for mileage, we can reimburse for gas with receipts or the cost of a rental car, but we would not reimburse for both the mileage and gas. Our lodging and per diem rates now match federal rates, and this information can be found on our travel reimbursement rates section of our website. And you can also pay for parking fees and tolls, which are incurred during your project, but receipts are needed for all of those costs. All right, so that was the RFD section. Now we can move into the progress reports. So all RFDs must include a progress report, and we have a progress report template for you to use, which is found on our website and in the grantee manual. The progress report period should match the billing period on the invoice. And in the progress report, you'll provide an overall project update and describe project made in that period per task. And these descriptions should support the costs billed. The progress report also includes a deliverables table, which is shown here, to track your deliverables. And we love photos, we love stories, so you don't have to include these in your progress report, but we love to see it, and you can send photos and stories directly to your project manager. All right, so now we're going to move into advanced funds. So our grants are reimbursed, are reimbursement based, meaning that grantees incur costs and then we reimburse the grantee for those costs. We have created an advanced funds program in response to the needs of some grantees, particularly for smaller nonprofit organizations who are unable to upfront the costs of a project if it would lead to significant financial burden. So the Conservancy will prioritize recipient grantees serving disadvantaged, low-income, and under-resourced communities or organizations with modest reserves and potential cash flow problems for that advanced payment program. Speak with your project manager if you would like to request an advancement of funds. And please note that grantees must deposit the advanced funds in a federally insured interest-bearing account where deposits, including interest and withdrawals, are all tracked. So that was more on advanced funds. Again, if you think that you might want to participate in that program, definitely reach out to your project manager and they can help see if it's right for you and get you set up with that program. All right, and then last up, we have project completion. So how does it get all closed out? So for an implementation project, we typically require that your project manager conduct a site visit at the end of the project to view the completed work. And we also like to join in celebrating the completion of your projects. So please invite us to any other closing events, such as a community event or a ribbon cutting. Then next is submitting all project completion documentation. So you need to submit all final deliverables to your PM. And then when you submit that final RFD and report, make sure you check this little box here that's circled that says final invoice. And that will make sure that you get your withholding released. And then finally, there are many, many guidance documents, templates, examples, all on our website under the resources for grantees page, as well as our technical assistance page. So definitely check that out. And I think we have time, so I'll just show you all really quick how to access that. So let's stop sharing. And I will show you our website page really quick, and then we can move into questions that people have. Okay. So here is our website, scc.ca.gov. You can navigate to grants. Then you can go down to resources for grantees. And here you'll see the grantee manual. This is just the full manual. And lots more information, grant management guidance, where all of our logos are, some surveys, lots and lots of information, all of the invoicing info. Also, we have resources available in Spanish. And then if I click on grantee manual, there's a breakdown of each section here with all of the links to templates and example documents, or you can just download the full grantee manual. And then finally, I'll just show also under grants, the technical assistance page, which, yeah, is just overall super helpful examples for how to write a competitive grant application, managing your grant, other resources, yeah, and then resources in Spanish. So definitely check out our website if you have questions while you're managing your grant. And with all that being said, I think we can move on to final questions.
Hi, I had a question.
Yeah.
Serene. Yeah. So just to clarify, you said mileage can be reimbursed, but not gas, so you can do both. It's just one or the other.
One or the other.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Yeah, Mark.
Okay, yeah, I'll jump in with a quick question. For subcontractor invoices, if the entire amount of that subcontractor invoice is not being billed to the grant, I think this is something I've done in the past with SCC grants, but just want to confirm that you can sort of annotate that invoice with a note about what percentage of that total invoice is going to the SCC grant. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. We allow that.
Thank you.
I can take one in the chat that I was starting to type.
Yeah, sure.
Jolene asked, can you cover the procedures for billing staff time? And is there any guidance if it is different than the organization's policy? I was going to say, you can bill your staff's burdened hourly rate, meaning with benefits, but you'll do it by task. So if they spent 3 hours managing the grant and then 10 hours implementing, that's how you'd put it with their hourly rate. I'm not sure what you mean by organization's policy, so feel free to come off mute if that didn't answer your question.
Hey, Sarah, thank you. I was asking in regards to sick and holiday pay, because normally we just charge the grant agencies whatever ADP charges, and then, but the California's or the Coastal Conservancy guidance that I seen said that there is no sick or holiday pay included, so I have to do some fancy math. Is that correct?
Linda, you can correct me, but I think generally it's hours worked on the grant is what you'd bill. Is that right?
Yes. I think I'm not quite understanding the sick and holiday pay piece. Like if that's already calculated within a staff's rate at the organizational level, as Sarah mentioned, you can like bill that to us at the fully burdened rate. But in tracking how you're billing that within the grant, you would just mention like, you know, how many hours that staff person has worked per task.
Yeah, I think I seen it in the guidance where you're supposed to add up all the sick time and holiday pay that they work in a year, find that burdened rate, and then bill out that burdened rate. We just have to verify with our auditor that that's allowable, because we don't do that with anybody else.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Greg, you had a question?
Yeah, just to kind of summarize that. So after our notice to proceed letter, the date on that, we can charge our billable hours for staff at the county along with our consultant that we hire.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And there's
Also, I think I might have forgotten to mention for subcontractors, it's okay if you don't know all of your subcontractors when you first start the grant. So just if you're going to hire someone new, email your PM so we can review and approve them before you bill them to your next invoice.
And Andy had a good question in the chat here that I just wanted to read out loud. In the event of changes to the budget or adjustments in task, is there an amendment process highlighted in the grant agreement or on the resources page? And Sarah answered it, but basically the process is just to communicate with your project manager and discuss amending the work program for schedule or task budget adjustments first, because that is far easier and much more flexible, amending the work program. We can, if needed later on, amend the grant agreement, but yeah, the first step would always be to see if we can amend the work program for any budget changes or task changes.
And to add to that, any request to extend the grant date because of, unavoidable project delays would require an amendment to the grant, but we can definitely work with you on doing that as well. It's just a bit of a process, but definitely doable. Let's see. Trying to see if there's any other questions from the chat that we should pull up.
Do you want to do Peter's question from the chat, Linda?
Travel reimbursement?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, lodging is now at federal rate, but meals per diem are at the state rate. Oh, and Sarah did answer. So the state rates for both lodging and meals should match the federal rates now, but please do refer to the rates that are published on the state website, because that is what we will go off of. And that is at benefits.calhr.ca.gov. And yeah, you'd be able to search Google for the travel reimbursement rates.
We also usually, I think there's a link to it in our work program template, and you can just leave the link in so it's easy to check while you're working on your grant.
Hi, this is
Peter.
Peter. Yeah, so that was my question. And as far as I can tell, the state travel reimbursement totals don't match the GSA, the federal totals, because the federal totals are based on locality, whereas the state ones seem to be statewide. So for instance, the meals and incidental total on the state website is up to 68 and federal is up to 86 for Mendocino County where we are.
Got it. Yes. Yeah, in that case, yeah, please refer to the CalHR rates.
Okay, but the lodging is at the federal rate?
So the CalHR website will also have the lodging rate for the state. They just were increased to, I believe they should match the federal rates more closely at least, but for both of those, go to the CalHR website. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we're saying use
go
state
to
rates.
CalHR. Yeah.
Okay, but the SCC travel reimbursement guidance that y'all have online says lodging hotels are capped at the federal rates.
Let's take a look at that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can follow up on that with the recording and stuff, because I think maybe that was they got increased, but maybe they increased again. I'm not sure. We'll figure that out.
Yeah,
Great,
we'll
thank
double
you.
check.
Any other questions? Well, if not, feel free to reach out to your Conservancy project manager by email anytime. And we'll share these slides and follow up on any clarifications afterwards with you all.
Bye. Have a good one.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much for your guidance.